The night, Lyra stepped in front of a stranger and caught a black iron bolt through her shoulder. 700 warriors were already sleeping in their saddles 3 valleys away, not knowing they would kneel to her by dawn. She did not know it either. She only knew the cold. The way station at Ebonmark Crossing had been cold her whole life, the wind off the salt road cutting through the stone seams, no matter how many rags she stuffed into the gaps. And on wolf moon nights like this one, the torches outside guttered sideways, and the flames learned to lie flat against their iron sconces like frightened animals. Lyra had been the one to light them since she was 16. 6 years of climbing the wet stone stair with a pitch-soaked brand. 6 years of watching travelers pass through without ever learning her name. 6 years of being the sent deaf girl from the border village, the one whose first shift never came, the one the old women at home had stopped waiting on before she turned 12. In her village they had a word for women like her: broken. They said it the way other people said ordinary, without heat, as if it were simply the shape of a thing. Lyra had learned to answer to it the way a dog answers to a whistle, without loving it, without arguing, only turning her face toward the sound. What she didn't know, as she climbed down from the last torch that wolf moon night with pitch on her knuckles and frost in her lashes, was that in less than an hour the blood inside her shoulder would spill onto a piece of carved bone at a stranger's throat, and that bone would start singing a name her mother had spent 22 years burying. She shouldered open the way station door. The common room smelled like wet wool and old stew, and the particular sour tang of travelers who had not washed in a week. Old Bremmel nodded at her from behind the trestle, and the 2 salt merchants by the fire did not look up. She was already moving toward the hearth when the door behind her banged open a second time, and the cold came back in on the heels of a girl who should not have been out alone on a wolf moon night. The girl was 19 at most. Lyra's quick eye put her there by the silver coming-of-age braid twisted at her temple, a ridge country style Lyra had only ever seen on the coin side of a trader's purse. She was muddy to the knees. One sleeve was torn clean through at the shoulder, and under the tear the skin was scraped raw and already going purple. She had one hand closed white-knuckled around something at her throat, a carved bone token on a leather thong, and her breath was coming in the high, thin gulps of a person who had been running for hours, and was only now realizing she could not run any further. Her eyes found Lyra's across the room, and for one strange, suspended moment, neither of them moved. Later, Lyra would think about that moment a great deal, the way the girl looked at her as if she were trying to decide something, the way the torchlight caught the carved bone and made it look, just for a breath, as if it were lit from inside. Then the door banged a third time, and the moment ended. 3 men came through it with the easy, shoulder-rolling walk of hunters who were used to their quarry already being tired. They wore a dark green livery Lyra did not recognize, stitched with a sigil of a hollow circle pierced by a thorn, and each of them carried a crossbow already spanned. The lead hunter was a tall, narrow man, with a scar that pulled one corner of his mouth permanently upward, so that he seemed to be smiling, even as he raised his weapon and sighted down the length of it toward the girl at Lyra's hearth. Lyra saw the bolt tip then. She had grown up the daughter of a midwife, and her mother had taught her, in the quiet hours when the village was not listening, the names of metals a healer should know: silver, copper, cold iron, and the one metal no shifter's blood could close around, the one metal that drank magic the way dry wool drank rain. Black iron. The bolt tip was black iron. The girl at the hearth made a small sound, not a word, only a breath shaped like no, and her hand tightened on the bone at her throat, and Lyra, who had spent 22 years stepping aside for everyone, stepped sideways instead. She did not plan it. Her body simply moved, the way a body moves when it has finally decided it is tired of being polite. She put herself between the crossbow and the girl, and she heard the hunter say something that might have been a curse or might have been a prayer. And then the bolt took her through the meat of the shoulder above the collarbone and drove her back 2 full steps into the stranger's arms. The pain arrived a heartbeat late. It arrived in colors she did not have names for. The girl caught her around the ribs, and Lyra felt her own blood spray warm across the bone token, and somewhere very far away, as if from inside a deep well, she thought she heard something hum. Old Bremmel was shouting. The salt merchants were scrambling backward over their bench. The lead hunter was already working the crank of his crossbow for a second shot, and the 2 behind him were fanning out into the room with the calm, practiced economy of men who had done this kind of work before and expected to do it again before the moon set. Lyra could not feel her left arm. She could feel, with a clarity that seemed almost unfair, the warmth of the stranger's chest against her spine and the fast, frantic drumming of the stranger's heart against her shoulder blade. She could feel the bone token, wet now, pressed between the girl's palm and her own blood-soaked collar. And she could feel the hum. It was not a sound, exactly. It was lower than sound. It was the feeling of a string drawn tight inside her ribs that had been slack her entire life and was, for reasons she did not understand, beginning to tune itself. The stranger behind her was speaking, low and urgent, in a language Lyra half knew, Ridge dialect, the old northern tongue, the one her mother used to hum to her before sleep, and then stopped humming, the year Lyra turned 7, without ever explaining why. The girl was saying over and over, get up, we have to get up," and Lyra was trying, she was trying. And then the lead hunter's second bolt was spanned and coming up, and a table slammed into him from the side so hard the crossbow went spinning into the hearth. Old Bremmel had finally moved. He was a thick man, thick in the way old stonework is thick, and he had lifted the trestle table as if it weighed nothing, and driven its edge into the hunter's ribs. And the hunter went down with a sound like a barrel breaking. The 2 other hunters turned as one. Lyra saw one of them raise his weapon toward Bremmel, and she tried to shout, and nothing came out but a thin, wet sound. And then the way station door, which had been shut against the wind, came off its top hinge. It came off because a shoulder hit it. The shoulder belonged to a man Lyra had never seen before, and for one unhinged moment her pain-blurred eyes refused to fit him inside the doorframe, because he should not have been able to stand inside a doorframe. He was tall the way the old carved pillars at the mountain shrines were tall, and he was wearing road leathers and a wolf-gray cloak stiff with frost, and his eyes in the torchlight were the color of new-struck steel. He did not speak. He crossed the room in 3 strides. The first hunter he took by the throat and lifted clean off his feet, and set down again against the wall, hard enough that the mortar cracked. The second he disarmed with a twist of his wrist that made the man scream once, high and clean, before he hit the floor. The lead hunter, half crushed under Brummel's table, tried to reach for a knife, and the stranger in the gray cloak put one boot on his wrist and said, in a voice like a low stone rolling downhill, "You will not." And then, astonishingly, The stranger looked up, and his steel-colored eyes found Lyra where she sagged against the ridge girl's chest, with black iron buried in her shoulder. And something happened in his face that she was in no condition to interpret. It was not surprise. It was closer to recognition. It was the look of a man who had walked into a room expecting one thing and found instead the one thing his life had been quietly organized around without his knowledge. For one long second he did not move. Then he was crossing to her, kneeling, his big scarred hands hovering over the shaft of the bolt without touching it, as if she were a thing that might come apart if handled wrong. "Ridge girl," the girl behind Lyra was saying his name. "Thane, Thane, it's black iron. Thane, she took it for me, Thane." The man whose name was Thane did not look away from Lyra's face. He said, very quietly, "Can you hear me?" Lyra's vision was beginning to spark at the edges. She wet her lips. She said, through teeth that had started to chatter, "I can hear you. I'm scent deaf, not actually deaf." And some part of her was appalled at herself for making a joke at such a moment. And some other, stranger part noted that the man flinched as if she had struck him. And then, very carefully, as if laying down something holy, he put one hand against the side of her neck to steady her and said, "Stay with me." She would remember the weight of that hand for the rest of her life. She would remember also the way the ridge girl behind her said, in a voice that had gone suddenly much older and much more frightened, "Thane, look at the charm." He looked. Lyra, drifting now, did not, but she felt it, the hum under her ribs, climbing another note, and she heard Thane Ashfall, war-sworn second to Alpha King Care Vale of the Northern Ridges, say a word in the old tongue that her mother had told her never to say aloud. She did not remember being carried upstairs. She remembered pieces. She remembered the stranger's cloak going around her shoulders, and the rough warmth of the wool smelling like cold pine and smoke, and something underneath those, something her scent-deaf nose should not have been able to register at all, but did, faintly, like a sound heard through water. She remembered the ridge girl, Sable, saying her own name at last. "I'm Sable. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And Lyra trying to say, "It's all right," and not quite making it. She remembered the small, cramped upstairs room with the pallet and the washstand, and old Bremmel standing in the doorway, looking 10 years older than he had an hour ago, and Thane Ashfall setting her down on the pallet with a gentleness that did not match the size of his hands. She remembered him saying to Sable, "I cannot pull it. Not with black iron. The wound will not close on its own, and it will not close on mine." Sable's voice, tight. "Then what?" Thane, quieter. "We wait for the healer. We keep pressure. We keep her warm. We keep her awake." And then, softer, almost to himself, "We keep her." Lyra's eyes were closed, but her mouth still worked. She said, "I don't even know you." There was a long pause. When he answered, his voice had gone careful, the way a man's voice goes careful around a wild thing he does not want to startle. He said, "I know. I'm sorry for that. I am going to know you now, if you will allow it." And Lyra, bleeding into a stranger's cloak in a room above a way station on the salt road, half out of her mind with cold and pain and the strange tuning hum under her ribs, laughed. It was a terrible little laugh, wet and crooked. She said, "Allow it," he says, "like I'm a lady." Sable, from the other side of the pallet, made a sound that was almost a sob and almost a laugh. She said, "You are tonight. You are whatever you want to be tonight. You took a bolt from me. You can be queen of the salt road if you want." Lyra opened her eyes a crack. The Ridge girl's face was very close. Up close, Sable Vale was beautiful in a way that had been sanded and polished by privilege, the kind of beauty that spoke of regular meals and careful hands. But her eyes were red, and her mouth was trembling, and she looked, in that moment, exactly 19 and exactly terrified. Lyra said, "Why were they after you?" Sable's throat worked. She said, "My uncle arranged a bond for me. Against my will. I ran. He sent the hollow pack to bring me back before the ceremony. They are not supposed to be able to hurt me. They are supposed to bring me home, bruised but breathing. The one with the scar, he drew on me before he knew who I was, because I'd cut my hair and muddied the braid, and he didn't see the silver in it." "And you," she stopped. "You stepped in front. Lyra, is that your name? I heard the old man say it." Lyra closed her eyes again. "Lyra," she said. "Lyra of Ebonmark. Torchbearer. Nobody." Thane Ashfall, from her other side, said, "Not nobody." He said it flat and absolute, the way a man lays down a verdict. Lyra did not have the strength to argue. She said, "The charm. It was humming. I felt it." Sable made a small sound. Thane said, "Show her." Sable's hand came into Lyra's field of vision, and in her palm was the carved bone token, and the carving on it was moving. Not moving like a living thing, moving like a thing with heat under it. The lines of it, spirals and old runes Lyra did not know, were glowing faintly silver, the kind of silver you see on water at dawn, and where Lyra's blood had dried on it, the silver was brightest. Lyra stared. She said, "What is that?" Sable's voice, very small. "It's a summoning charm. It calls the Ridge warriors to the nearest high ground by first light, once it's been blooded by the one it answers to." Lyra's mouth had gone dry. She said, "Once it's been blooded by the one it answers to." "Yes," Sable swallowed. "It was given to me by my father, to carry on the road, in case I needed to call them. It was supposed to wake to my blood." Lyra looked at her own blood on the bone. She said, "But that's my blood." "Yes, and it's waking." Lyra looked up at Thane. His face was a careful mask, but the muscle in his jaw had gone rigid, and his steel eyes were fixed on the token, as if it had turned into a snake. Lyra said, very slowly, because her voice was the only thing she could still control, "What does that mean?" Thane said, "Nothing." He said it like a man shutting a door. "Not tonight. Tonight it means nothing. Tonight it means we keep you breathing, and we wait for the healer, and we see what the dawn brings." Lyra, who had been stepped around her whole life, who had been called broken before she was old enough to know what breaking was, looked at this enormous, quiet man kneeling at her pallet with her blood on his cloak, and realized, without being able to say how she knew, that he was lying to her, to protect her. She almost laughed again. She said into the wool of his cloak, "Everyone lies to the torchbearer." He did not answer, but she felt, very faintly, his thumb move once against the side of her neck where his hand had not left. A small, steadying stroke, and under her ribs the hum, which had quieted, picked up one thin, new note. The healer came at the hour before dawn. She was a thin woman from 2 villages south, with hands like birch twigs, and she took one look at the bolt in Lyra's shoulder, and at the carved bone on the washstand, and at Thane Ashfall, standing against the wall, with his arms folded and his face unreadable, and she said, "I will need boiling water, clean linen, and everyone but the wolf out of this room." Sable opened her mouth to argue. Thane said, "Do as she says." Sable went. The healer worked. Lyra did not remember most of it. She remembered the hot, bright animal pain when the shaft came free, and she remembered biting down on a folded strip of leather, and she remembered Thane's hand, which had somehow come back to the side of her neck without her noticing, and she remembered hearing him breathing, slow and deliberate, as if he were trying to lend her the rhythm. When the healer finally straightened, her face was grim. She said, "The wound is clean, but the metal was in too long. It will not close the way wounds like this should close. She will carry it. She will not die tonight, if the fever does not take her, but—" She looked at Thane. She said, "You know what black iron does." Thane said, "I know." The healer nodded once. She said, "Then you know she will not feel what the rest of us feel, not while the splinters are in her, not if they stay." Thane said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Thank you." And he paid her in coin that did not look like way-station coin, and the healer left. Lyra had not slept. She was past sleep now, in that strange, clear country past exhaustion, and she listened to this exchange with the detachment of someone watching a play. She said from the pallet, "What won't I feel?" Thane turned toward her. The gray light from the shutter slats caught the side of his face, and she saw, for the first time, that he was younger than she had thought. Not young, but younger, maybe 30, scarred across one cheekbone in a way that suggested a claw once, a long time ago. He said, "You don't have to worry about that tonight." Lyra said, "I am very tired of being told what I don't have to worry about tonight. Tell me what I won't feel." He crossed to the pallet. He sat on the low stool the healer had left. He put his forearms on his knees and laced his fingers together, and he looked at them for a while before he looked at her. He said, "Among my people, there is a thing called the bond. It is not a marriage exactly. It is older than marriage. It is a recognition. 2 people meet, and something under the skin of the world tells them, 'This one.' It is not common. Most of my people go their whole lives without feeling it. Those who do feel it describe it as a hum, a thread, a warmth in the chest, a knowing." Lyra, very still, said, "A hum." Thane's eyes came up to hers. He said, "Yes." Lyra said, "Like the charm." Thane said, "No, not like the charm. The charm is a separate matter, and we will speak of it. But the hum I am describing is older than any charm. It cannot be forged. It cannot be forced. It is simply a fact of 2 people who were, for whatever reason the old powers decided, meant to find each other." Lyra's throat was very dry. She said, "And I won't feel it." Thane said, "The black iron in your shoulder will dull it, on your side. It will not dull it on mine." Lyra stared at him. She said, "You are telling me you feel it." He said, "I am telling you I felt it when the door came off its hinge.
I am telling you, I feel it now. I am telling you, I will not speak of it again, if you do not wish me to, until you are healed and standing on your own feet and in a position to decide for yourself whether you wish to hear it at all. But I will not lie to you about it. You have already been lied to enough tonight, and I suspect for many nights before tonight, and I will not add my voice to that chorus. Lyra did not know what to say. Some part of her, the part that had been called broken her entire life, wanted to laugh in his face. Some other part, the part that had stepped in front of a crossbow, wanted to reach up and put her good hand against his cheek and see what his skin felt like under her palm. She did neither. She said, instead, "Why me?" He said, "I don't know." Lyra said, "You're a terrible liar." He said, "I am not lying. I genuinely do not know. I rode here to retrieve the princess, and I walked through a broken door, and I saw a woman bleeding in a stranger's arms, and my second self, the part of me I have spent 20 years teaching to be quiet, said, 'There, that one.' And I have been arguing with him since, and losing." Lyra blinked. She said, "Your second self." Thane almost smiled. It was the first expression that had softened his face all night, and it changed him. He said, "Every one of my kind carries one, a wolf under the skin. He talks to me. He has opinions. He is, at the moment, extremely pleased with himself, and extremely displeased with the black iron in your shoulder, and he is informing me, repeatedly, that we are not leaving this room until it is out." Lyra, against everything, laughed. It hurt. She laughed anyway. She said, "Is he always this bossy?" Thane said, "Only about things that matter." Outside the shutter, faintly, a horn sounded. Not near, not yet, but clear. A low, two-note call that Lyra had never heard before in her life, and that, under her ribs, the hum answered. Thane's head came up. His face changed. He stood. He went to the window and opened the shutter a crack and looked out at the gray eastern sky, and Lyra saw his shoulders go still in the particular way a man's shoulders go still when he is looking at something he has been half expecting and fully dreading. He said, without turning, "Sable." Sable came through the door. Thane said, "The column is closer than I thought." Sable went very white. She said, "How close?" Thane said, "First light close. They will crest the ridge within the hour." Sable said, "But the charm, it was only blooded a few hours ago. It shouldn't—" Thane said, "I know." He turned from the window. His eyes found Lyra's again, and there was something in them now that had not been there before, something that looked almost like apology. He said, "Lyra of Ebonmark, I think you had better sit up, if you can. I think your life is about to become very complicated." And in the distance the horn sounded again, closer this time, and under Lyra's ribs the hum climbed one more note, and the first thin line of dawn came in through the shutter slats and laid itself across the carved bone on the washstand like a finger finding a pulse. They carried her up to the ridge on a litter woven from the way station's spare cloaks. Lyra had argued. Thane had, very simply, not engaged the argument, and Sable had threatened to sit on her, and old Bremmel had said, "Girl, you have bled on my floor for the first time in 6 years. You will allow a little help." And that had been the end of it. The ridge above Ebenmark was a long spine of wind-scraped stone, with an old cairn at its peak, a pile of river rocks stacked by hands long dead, marked with weather-smoothed runes Lyra had climbed past 100 times on torch-lighting rounds, and never read. The sun was just cracking the eastern rim when they reached the cairn, and the wind up there was the knife-edged kind that made eyes water, and Lyra, propped half-sitting against Thane's folded cloak, with her left arm bound tight to her chest, saw them. 700. It was not a number she had ever had occasion to picture before. 700 was an abstraction, a figure from a traveler's tale. 700 warriors in the flesh was something else. They were coming up the long slope from the north in a loose, disciplined column, 4 and 5 abreast where the ground allowed, and they were not all on horseback. Some were running. Some, Lyra realized with a slow, cold thrill, were not entirely in human shape. There were wolves among them, enormous gray and brindle and black, loping easily alongside the riders. And there were half-shifted forms too, men and women with claws and elongated jaws, and eyes that caught the new light like struck flint. At their head rode a man on a dappled war-horse, and even at this distance Lyra could see he was big, Thane big, and that he wore a circlet of plain hammered iron across his brow, and that his cloak was the deep wine red of dried blood. Sable, beside the litter, made a small broken sound. She said, "My father." Thane said, "Steady." Sable said, "He's going to. I don't know what he's going to." Thane said, "Steady, princess. He is your father before he is anything else," Sable said. "And after he is my father, he is the Alpha King, and the Alpha King is going to want answers, and the answers are—" She looked down at Lyra. Her eyes were shining. She said, "Lyra, I am so sorry. Whatever happens now, I am so sorry." Lyra, who had not yet fully processed the 700, said, "For what?" Sable did not answer. The column came up the ridge. At 50 paces, Caervale raised his hand, and the column halted with a sound like a single long breath. At 20 paces, he dismounted. At 10, he stopped. He was a tall man, in his middle 50s, weathered, silver threading a black beard, and his eyes were the same steel as Thane's, which Lyra belatedly understood was perhaps not a coincidence of lighting, but a marker of kind. He looked at Sable first. His jaw worked once. He said, "Daughter." Sable said, "Papa." It came out very small. Caervale closed the last 10 paces in 3 strides, and took his daughter by the shoulders and looked at her, hard, the way a man inventories a thing he had been afraid he had lost. His hands on her were careful. He said, "You are hurt." Sable said, "Scrapes. Papa, scrapes. I'm all right." He said, "You ran." She said, "I ran." He said, "We will speak of why." She said, "We will." Caervale nodded, once, and then his steel eyes slid past his daughter and found the litter, and found Lyra on it, pale as paper, with a stranger's cloak over her legs, and a black iron wound packed with clean linen under her collarbone. And they found, finally, the carved bone token lying on her chest, where Sable had set it when she could no longer bear to hold it herself. Caervale went very still. He said, "Thane." Thane said,
My king. Care said, the charm. Thane said, woke wrong, or woke right. I do not know which.
It was blooded by this woman who stepped in front of a hollow pack bolt meant for your daughter.
My king, she is not of the ridge. She is a torchbearer at the way station below. Care, said hollow pack. His voice did not rise, it dropped. It went down into the low register men's voices go when they are considering which of several terrible options to choose. He said, my brother's men. Thane said, yes, 3 of them, held below under Bremel's eye and a good rope. Care said, we will speak of my brother shortly. He turned his attention fully to Lyra. Up close he was not unkind. That was the first thing Lyra noticed. His face was carved and tired, and she could see the father in it as well as the king. He knelt. The 700 behind him did not move. He said to her, what is your name? She said, Lyra. Lyra of Ebonmark, sir. She did not know how to address a king. He almost smiled. He said, Lyra of Ebonmark, may I? He held one hand toward the bone token on her chest, not touching, asking. She nodded. He lifted the token by its thong. The glow of it had not faded. If anything, it was brighter now, silver running through the carved spirals like water finding old channels. And when Care Vale held it up into the dawn, the light from it and the light from the sun met somewhere in the middle and made a small, bright point that hurt to look at. Care Vale looked at it for a long time. Then he looked back at Lyra. His face had done something complicated. He said, Child, do you know what your mother's name was? Lyra said, Mira. Mira of Ebonmark. She was the midwife before me. She died when I was 9. Care said, before Ebonmark. Lyra said, I don't. She never said. He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed a thing he had not wanted confirmed. He said, Mira of the Hollow Root. That is the name this charm answers to. It was forged 4 generations ago by a woman of the Hollow Root line to call the ridge to her defense in a time when the ridge had forgotten her. It was thought lost. It was thought the line was lost. He looked at Sable. He said, Daughter, who gave you this? Sable, whose mouth had fallen slightly open, said, You did. Care said, I gave you a charm that had been in our vault for a century. I did not know which charm it was. I thought it was a summoning marker only. I did not know it was this one. Lyra said, I don't understand. Care Vale turned back to her. He said, Lyra of Ebonmark, your mother was not a village midwife. Your mother was the last daughter of a line my people exiled, for reasons I now suspect were not the reasons we were told. The charm answers to her blood. It answers, therefore, to yours. He drew a long breath. He said, And it has answered. Behind him, the 700, who had been standing at easy attention, began, in a ripple that went down the column like wind across wheat, to kneel. Lyra watched them go down. She watched the wolves among them lower their great heads and put their chins to the stone. She watched the half-shifted ones press palms and claws to the ground. She watched men and women in road leathers and war leathers and the wine red of the king's household drop to one knee on the cold ridge stone. And she watched, last of all,
Kervale himself go to one knee beside her litter and bow his head. She said, "Oh no." She said it very quietly. She said, "Oh no, please don't. Please. I'm the torchbearer. I just light the torches. Please stand up." Sable was crying now. Thane was not kneeling. Thane was standing at the head of the litter with his hand on the shaft of it, and his face was the mask again, but his steel eyes, when they met hers, were not masked at all.
They were the eyes of a man watching something he had suspected become something he could no longer unsee. Lyra looked up at him. She said, through a throat that would not quite work, "You knew." He said, "I guessed. I did not know." Lyra said, "When?" Thane said, "When the charm glowed, at the way station. I did not say because I was not sure, and because you were bleeding out, and because you did not need, on top of everything else tonight, to be told that your life had never been the shape you thought it was." Lyra, to her own horror, began to laugh. It was a small, exhausted sound, and it turned almost at once into something that was not a laugh, and Sable took her good hand and held it, and Kervale, still kneeling, said, very gently, "Child, breathe. We will not rush you. We have 700 reasons to wait. Take your time." They took her back down the ridge slowly, because the wind had picked up, and the litter-bearers were being careful, and because Kervale had quietly made it clear that anyone who jostled her would answer for it personally. By the time they reached the way station, the sun was fully up, and the common room, which had been a way station an hour before, had somehow become a war council. Maps had appeared. A long trestle had been dragged into the center and covered with them. Runners were coming and going. Old Bremmel, looking torn between pride and terror, was pouring tea for men who had never in their lives been offered tea by an innkeeper at Ebonmark Crossing. Lyra was installed by the fire, in the big chair that normally held Bremmel's elderly hound, and the hound, who was named Fay, and who had never shown any preference for human company, had climbed up beside her and laid her grey muzzle across Lyra's good knee and refused to be moved. Thane had remarked, looking at this arrangement, that animals knew things first.
Lyra had been too tired to ask what he meant.
The kidnapping attempt came at mid-morning. That was how fast things moved now. A rider came down off the north road with a flagged lance and a ridge sigil stitched to his cloak, and he was admitted, and he knelt to Care, and he delivered a sealed message, and Care read it, and his face did not change, but the hand holding it went white at the knuckles. He said to the room, "My brother Oric requests the immediate return of my daughter, and the, quote, pretender at her side, for, quote, questioning regarding the corruption of a sacred relic," end quote. He looked up. He said, "He has brought 100 of his own to the lower pass. He is prepared, he says, to escort us home." The room went quiet. Thane said, "How kind of him." Care said, "How very like him." Sable, who had been sitting at Lyra's other side, said, "Papa, it was him. It was always him. The bond he arranged for me. It was to one of his own captains. He meant to put his man in my bed and his blood on the ridge throne through my children. He sent the hollow pack to bring me back because I ran before the ceremony. He would have said it was for my protection." Care's jaw worked. He said, "I know, daughter. I know now. I did not know yesterday. I am sorry." Sable said, "I know, Papa." Care turned to Lyra.
he said. And you, child, your mother. My brother was the one who pushed for the exile of the Hollowroot line. He said it was for the purity of the bloodlines. He said it was tradition. He was very persuasive. I was 22. I believed him. I have believed him for 30 years. Lyra said, from her chair, with Faye the Hound heavy and warm against her leg, I don't know what to do with that. Care said, you do not have to do anything with it today. Today you rest. Today we deal with Oric. Tomorrow we speak of what you wish to be called, and how you wish to live.
And he meant it. That was the thing that undid Lyra, more than the kneeling, more than the charm, more than the steel-eyed war-sworn who was watching her from across the room with a careful stillness that made her stomach turn over. Care Vale, Alpha King of the Northern Ridges, the man who commanded 700 warriors and had just learned his own brother had betrayed him, was asking her, in the middle of a crisis, what she wished to be called. She said, Lyra, just Lyra, for now. He bowed his head. He said, just Lyra it is. They moved her upstairs before the parley. Thane carried her because she was still too light-headed to walk, and because Faye the Hound insisted on coming, and because Sable refused to leave her side. He carried her as if she weighed nothing. He set her down on the pallet, which had been made up fresh. He said, I have to go down. I have to be at the parley. Care will want me at his shoulder. Lyra said, I understand. He said, I do not want to go. She said, I know. His hand hovered near her face, not touching. He said, May I? She nodded. He touched very lightly the edge of her jaw with his knuckle. She felt the warmth of it. She did not feel the hum. The black iron in her shoulder was doing its work. She saw his eyes note that, saw him register that she felt nothing of what he was feeling, and saw him accept it without flinching. He said, When this is done, when the metal is out, I will come and sit with you, and I will tell you everything I know about the bond, and you will tell me whether you want any part of it, and if you do not, I will step back, and I will not speak of it again. He paused. He said, But I will still stand between you and the next crossbow. That is not a bond thing. That is a me thing. Lyra, whose eyes had started to burn, said, You are a ridiculous man. He said, I am told. He did not kiss her. He almost did. His hand slid from her jaw to the side of her neck, the way it had last night, and his thumb moved once, and his head bent a fraction, and then Faye the Hound made a small warning grumble at the door, because a runner had come up the stair, and Thane straightened. He said, under his breath, Later. She said, Later. He went. The parley went badly, which Lyra had expected, and at the same time it went exactly as Care Vale had intended, which Lyra had not. Oric Vale came up to the way-station forecourt with an honor guard of 12, and the rest of his 100 a polite distance back. He was a smaller, sleeker version of his brother, silver where Care was iron, smooth where Care was weathered. He smiled a great deal. Lyra, watching from the upstairs shutter with Sable pressed to her good side, disliked him immediately. Oric spoke of misunderstandings. Oric spoke of a corrupted relic that needed to be, regrettably, destroyed, along with the hand that had corrupted it. Oric spoke, in the mellow, patient voice of a man explaining something to a difficult child, of the dangers of letting old, buried bloodlines crawl out of their graves. And Care, letting him talk,
arranged his answer. His answer was this. He walked to the edge of the forecourt, and he raised his hand, and from the ridgeline above 700 warriors stood up out of the gorse where they had been lying down in plain sight the entire time Oric had been talking. And Oric, for the first time in what Lyra suspected was a very long life of winning conversations, stopped talking. Care said, "Brother, did you think I came with an honor guard?" Oric said, "Care." Care said, "I came with a verdict." And then, because Caravale was, Lyra would learn, a king who believed in procedure, he read aloud the charges. Arranging a forced bond on a daughter of the line,
Dispatching sanctioned hunters with black iron against unarmed targets, conspiring against a sealed relic, conspiring across 3 decades to exile and erase the Hollowroot line for personal ambition. He read them in a voice that did not rise and did not waver, and when he was done he offered his brother the choice Ridgelaw had always offered traders of the blood: exile or the blade. Oric chose, as men like Oric always chose, neither. He drew. He had a dagger at his belt, a small ornate thing, and he came forward fast, faster than his slender frame suggested, and for one bright, terrible second, Lyra thought she was going to watch an Alpha King die in his own forecourt. But Caravale had been fighting since before Oric was born, and Thane Ashfall had been at Care's right hand for 15 years, and the dagger never reached Care's throat. Thane stepped in. He took the blade on his own forearm, turned the wrist that held it, and Oric's own dagger came around in the twist and went, by the clean, awful geometry of the motion, into Oric's own ribs, just under the breastbone. Oric looked down at it. He said, "Oh," he said, "that's not." And then he sat down, rather abruptly, and did not get up again. Lyra, at the shutter, closed her eyes. Sable, beside her, whispered, "He always said Ridgelaw was barbaric. He always said a civilized man did not need a blade." Lyra said, "And he died on his own." Sable said, "On his own, yes." Downstairs, Caravale knelt by his brother's body and put a hand on his forehead and did not speak for a long time. Then he rose, and he said, to the forecourt, "It is done. Send his 100 home under their own captains. We will speak of reparations to the Hollowroot line at the next full moon. For now." He looked up at the shutter where Lyra was. He said, "For now, we tend to the woman who took a bolt from my daughter." And the 700 behind him made a low sound in their throats that was not quite a cheer and not quite a howl, but something older and warmer than both. The black iron came out that evening. The ridge healer, a white-haired woman named Alina, who had come down with the column, had hands far steadier than the village healers, and a jar of pale salve that smelled like crushed mint and something older. She made Thane hold Lyra's good hand. She made Sable hold her head. She made old Bremmel boil more water than anyone had ever boiled in the way-station's kitchen. And she worked the black iron splinters out of Lyra's shoulder one by one, with fine silver tweezers, and a patience that did not hurry for anyone. And Lyra, who had thought she had known pain in the way-station common room the night before, discovered that she had not. She bit through the leather strap twice. Thane's hand under hers did not move. When the last splinter came free, Alina held it up in the tweezers, a thin black sliver no longer than an eyelash, and dropped it into a small, lead-lined box and closed the lid. She said, "There. Now the wound will close. Now the blood will answer to itself again."
She looked not unkindly at Thane. She said, "And now, wolf son, you may stop holding your breath. I could hear you doing it." Thane, to Lyra's astonishment, flushed. He said, "Apologies." Alina said, "None needed." She bandaged Lyra clean, dressed the wound with the pale salve, and left them, saying she would return at dawn. Sable, who had been white-lipped the entire time, kissed Lyra on the temple and whispered, "Sister," and went out. And then it was just Lyra and Thane and the small fire in the grate, and Fay the hound snoring at the foot of the pallet, and the black iron gone from her shoulder at last. The hum came back slowly. That was the first surprise. Lyra had braced herself for a flood, because Thane had warned her, carefully, that the bond might come in hard once the metal was out. It did not come in hard. It came in the way warmth comes back into frost-bitten fingers, a prickle first, then a flush, then a long, slow ache of feeling where there had been none. She lay very still and let it arrive. Thane, sitting on the low stool, did not speak. He was watching her face. He was, she realized, letting her do this in her own time, with her own pace, and not crowding her with his own feeling about it. She said, finally, "Oh." He said, "Oh." She said, "It's—" She did not have words. She said, "You. I can feel you." He said, "Yes." She said, "You're—" She almost laughed. She said, "You're terrified." He said, "I am." She said, "Of what?" He said, "Of you saying no." She looked at him. She said, "Thane Ashfall." He said, "Lyra of the Hollowroot." She said, "No, just Lyra, for now." He said, "Just Lyra." She said, "I am not going to say no tonight, but I am also not going to say yes tonight. I am going to say, 'Come here.'" He came. He sat on the edge of the pallet, careful of her shoulder, and he bent his forehead to hers, and she smelled, at last, the thing she had half smelled in his cloak the night before, cold pine and smoke, and something underneath that, something that was just him, and under her ribs the hum settled into a long, low, satisfied note. And she understood, without anyone having to explain it, that this was what people meant when they said, "Homecoming." She said, against his mouth, almost, "I want to ask you something first." He said, "Ask." She said, "Your wolf, the one who talks to you, what is he saying right now?" Thane, whose restraint was costing him visibly, made a small, rough sound that was almost a laugh. He said, "He is saying, finally, 'You absolute idiot.'"
He said, "He is also saying, 'Be gentle. She is still wounded. If you bruise her, I will never forgive you.' And he is saying, 'She is ours. She has been ours since she stepped in front of that bolt, possibly since before. I do not understand time the way you do." Lyra, helplessly charmed, said, "I like him." Thane said, "He likes you. He has liked you since you made the joke about being scent deaf, not actually deaf. He said that was when he knew." Lyra said, "He has strong opinions about timing." Thane said, "He does." Then he kissed her. It was not a long kiss because she was tired, and because her shoulder still ached, and because neither of them wanted to rush a thing they had just been given permission to have. But it was a real kiss, careful and warm, and without apology. And when he drew back, his eyes were wet at the corners in a way Lyra pretended not to notice, because she suspected Thane Ashfall, war-sworn second, did not often allow himself to be seen that way. He said, "Rest. I will sit with you. Rest." She said, "Will you still be here when I wake?" He said, "Lyra, I will be here when you wake for as many mornings as you will have me." She slept. She dreamed, for the first time in a long while, of her mother. In the dream, her mother was sitting at the waystation hearth with her hair loose and her hands around a cup, and she was humming a song Lyra had not heard since she was 7. And when Lyra sat down across from her, her mother looked up and smiled and said, "So they found you." Lyra said, "You could have told me." Her mother said, "I could have. I was afraid. I am sorry." Lyra said, "Was I really broken?" Her mother said, "Oh, little fire, you were never broken. You were banked. There is a difference." And then the dream faded, and Lyra woke with tears on her face and Thane's hand on her wrist, and dawn coming in through the shutter, and the hum in her chest steady as a heartbeat. And for the first time in 22 years, she was not cold. They did not go to the ridge at once. That was Care's doing. He said at the breakfast trestle downstairs with the whole council around him and a pot of Bremel's best stew steaming between them, that the Holyrood heir had been dragged up a ridge and knelt to and bled for and nearly married off in the space of a single night, and that if he had anything to say about it, she would be given a week, at minimum, before anyone asked her to so much as sign her name. Sable had seconded this loudly. Thane had said nothing, but the set of his shoulders had said plenty. And so, for a week, the ridge camped in a wide, orderly ring around Ebonmark Crossing, and the way station became, briefly, the center of a kingdom. And Lyra learned things. She learned that her mother's people had been called Holyrood because their founding matriarch had carried her firstborn to term in the hollow of an old oak during a war, and that the line had been known for healers and for a strange silver fire that ran in the blood of a few of its daughters in a few of its generations. She learned that Oric had been quietly draining the vault of Holyrood relics for 30 years, trying to find one he could use, and never quite understanding that the relics answered to a blood he had personally exiled. She learned that she had second cousins, still alive, scattered in 2 border villages south, and that Care intended to send riders to find them and to offer, by name and in writing, the apology of the Ridge throne. She learned that her mother had not, in fact, been a disgraced midwife, but a woman who had walked out of the Ridge at 21 with nothing but the clothes on her back, because she had overheard a conversation she was not supposed to overhear, and that she had gone to Ebonmark because it was the last place anyone would think to look for her, and that she had married a quiet salt trader named Ellen, who had loved her without ever asking what she had left, and that she had died when Lyra was 9, not of fever, as Lyra had been told, but of a slow wasting that Alina, examining Lyra's memory of the symptoms with the careful patience of a detective, identified as long exposure to fine black iron dust, the kind that might be planted in a woman's bedding by a patient enemy over years. Lyra had to go outside after that. She sat on the way station wall and watched the Ridge camp for a long time and did not cry, because she had done her crying in the dream, and after a while Faye the Hound came and sat beside her, and after a longer while Sable came and sat on her other side, and after a longer while still, Thane came and did not sit, because Thane preferred to stand, but he put a hand on her uninjured shoulder and left it there,
and the four of them watched the sun go down over the salt road together. She also learned, which surprised her, that she liked the ridge. She had expected to resent them. She had expected to feel, among 700 people who had knelt to her before they knew her, like a fraud. Instead, she found that the ridge, in daylight and at ease, were not the mythic creatures of her mother's half-remembered stories, but people. They had bad jokes and blistered feet, and babies who cried at night, and old injuries they complained about. The warriors played a dice game with knucklebones that Lyra learned in an afternoon, and beat 3 of them at before dinner. A small girl named Cleo, perhaps 6 years old, daughter of one of Care's lieutenants, attached herself to Lyra on the 3rd day, with the absolute conviction of small children who have decided a thing, and followed her everywhere, and demanded to be told the story of the bolt over and over, and every time Lyra told it, the girl's eyes went wider at the same part, which was not the part about the bolt, but the part about Fay the hound climbing uninvited into Lyra's lap. Cleo said on the 4th day, very seriously, "Fay knew." Lyra said, "Knew what?" Cleo said, "Knew you were the one. Dogs know. I know. Babies know. Grown-ups are slow." And then she had scampered off to beg a sweet from Alina, leaving Lyra sitting on the wall with a lump in her throat she did not entirely understand. It was on the 5th day that the 2nd attack came, and it came from the direction no one had been watching. A cousin of Oric's, a man named Voss, who had been at the lower pass the day of the parley, and had been let ride home with the 100, came back at dusk with 6 men and a small, ugly weapon that was not a crossbow. It was a ridge thing, an old thing, a rune-cut bone horn meant to call up one of the lesser corrupted relics from the vault. And Voss had stolen one such relic before riding out, a black iron collar forged in the bad old years to bind unwilling bonds. His plan, as it was later pieced together, was to put the collar on Lyra, claim by the letter of an ancient law that a Holyrood heir could be bound to the ridge line through any willing ridge male, and produce a willing ridge male, himself, to do the binding. He meant to make himself consort and, through her, king. He got as far as the way station forecourt. Lyra was in the kitchen with Cleo, teaching her how to braid dough the way Lyra's mother had taught her, when she heard the horn. It was a low, wrong note, not like the ridge horn she had heard on the ridge at dawn. It was like that horn's shadow. It made Fay the hound, who was asleep under the table, surge up with her hackles raised and her lips peeled back from old yellow teeth, and it made Cleo drop a dough and clap her hands over her ears, and it made, under Lyra's ribs, the hum shriek. Lyra had never, in 5 days of learning the bond, felt it do anything like shriek. It felt like a struck bell made of pain. She knew, without being told, that the horn was calling for her, or for the thing in her blood, and that something very old was trying to put a leash on it. She moved. She did not think. She shoved Cleo behind her with her good arm. She shouted for Bremmel. She heard boots on the upstairs stair that were Thane's. She heard Sable shout from the common room, and she was at the kitchen door with a cleaver in her hand when Voss came through the forecourt gate with the black iron collar held up in both hands, like a priest with a sacrament. 3 things happened at once. Thane came down the stair 3 treads at a time, with his sword already drawn. Care came around the side of the way station with 4 of his warriors, and Cleo, behind Lyra, slipped out under Lyra's elbow and ran, with the terrible, unerring instinct of small children, straight toward Voss, because she had seen the horn, and she wanted to take it away from him, because she was 6, and she believed bad things could be solved by taking them away. Voss saw the child coming. He did not hesitate. Men like Voss never did. He dropped the collar and drew a knife and swung it, not at Cleo, but across her path in the kind of cruel, calculated slice meant to make a 6-year-old stop hard. He was not trying to kill her. He was trying to frighten her into freezing so he could grab her. It did not matter what he was trying.
The blade came down toward Cleo's face, and Lyra was too far away, and Thane was too far away, and Care was too far away. And Lyra, watching the little girl who had told her that grown-ups were slow, run straight at a dropping knife, felt the hum in her ribs stop shrieking and start singing. It came out of her in a single long silver note. She did not know what she was doing. She did not command it. It answered, the way she would much later learn such things always answered, not to command, but to love. A silver fire, thin and bright and almost weightless, leapt from her good hand across the forecourt and wrapped Cleo from crown to heel in a skin of light, and Voss's knife, when it struck that skin, bounced. It bounced the way a stone bounces off still water. And then the silver fire, as if it had opinions, uncoiled from around Cleo and went the other way. It went along the line of the knife, up the arm that held it, up into Voss. And Voss, who had been standing very upright with his mouth open to shout, was abruptly not standing. He was on his knees, then he was on his side, then he was still. The 6 men with him dropped their weapons and ran. They were cut down in the road by Care's warriors before they made 50 paces. Cleo, wrapped in fading silver, sat down very hard in the dirt and burst into tears. And Lyra, who had felt the fire leave her as if a rope had been cut inside her chest, sagged against the kitchen door frame and would have fallen if Thane had not crossed the forecourt at a speed she did not know he had, and caught her. The black iron collar lay in the dirt beside Voss's body. When Care picked it up, carefully, with a cloth, it was already cracked clean through. Alina would say later that whatever old magic had held it had, like the horn, recognized the silver fire and unmade itself rather than face it. Lyra did not hear that until much later, because when Thane caught her, she went straight down into a darkness that had no shape and no time, and she stayed there for 2 days. She woke in a room she did not know. The ceiling was high and timbered and carved with running wolves. The bed was wide and warm and smelled of clean linen and cedar. Through an open door she could hear, faintly, a woman humming. For a moment she did not know where she was, and then she did, because Thane Ashfall was asleep in a chair beside the bed, with his head tipped against the headboard, and his hand, even in sleep, on her wrist. She was in the ridge. She had been moved. She lay very still and looked at him for a while. He looked younger asleep. He looked, she thought, with a small inward laugh, like a man who had not slept properly in more days than was good for him. She slid her hand out from under his and put it, instead, over his. He woke instantly. His eyes, steel gray, opened and found her, and for a long second neither of them spoke. And then his face did the thing it had done in the way-station doorway a lifetime ago. The quiet, stunned recognition of a man finding, again, the thing his life had organized itself around. He said, "You're awake." She said, "I'm awake." He said, "Cleo is fine." She said, "I know. I can feel her. Through you." He blinked. She said, "I can feel a lot of things through you, Thane Ashfall. We are going to have a conversation about what is yours and what is mine." He said, very quietly,
Yes. She said, Not today. Today I would like breakfast and a bath, and to know where I am. He said, You are in the ridge, in my rooms specifically, because Care refused to put you anywhere else, and I refused to be farther than 10 paces from you, and Alina refused to have you moved again until you woke. She said, Efficient. He said, Ridge people are.
Alina came in a little later, scolded Thane affectionately for not waking her the moment Lyra opened her eyes, and pronounced Lyra well enough to eat soft food and sit up and receive visitors in small doses. The first visitor was Cleo, who climbed onto the bed without asking, planted herself on Lyra's good side, and said, with great seriousness, You glowed. Lyra said, I glowed. Cleo said, I want to glow. Lyra said, I am sorry. I don't think I can teach you that. Cleo said, That's all right. I will figure it out. And then Cleo laid her small, warm head on Lyra's collarbone, exactly over the scar that was already fading to pale silver instead of the angry red of a normal wound, and fell asleep there. And Lyra did not have the heart to move her. The second visitor was Sable, who brought flowers and tears, and a long, incoherent apology that Lyra eventually cut off by telling her sister, firmly, that no apology had ever been required, and she would hear no more of it. Sable said, Sister. Lyra said, Sister. It felt, unexpectedly, exactly right. The third visitor was Care. He came in quietly, with a folded cloth in his hand, and he sat on the low stool Alina had dragged beside the bed, and he said, Lyra of the Hollowroot, I owe you a thing. She said, You owe me nothing. He said, Be quiet, child. I am a king, and I am speaking. She shut her mouth. He almost smiled. He unfolded the cloth. Inside it was a thin silver circlet, old, worn at the edges, plainly made. He said, This belonged to your great-grandmother. It was in the vault. I am returning it to its line. You may wear it, or melt it, or throw it in the river, as you see fit. I only ask that it be yours to do that with, not mine. She took it. It was warm. She set it, without putting it on the small table beside the bed. She said, Thank you. He nodded. He said, And one other thing. She waited. He said, My war-sworn second, Thane Ashval, has requested leave from his oath to me, if you will have him as your own. I have granted it conditionally. The condition is that you be asked, directly, with no witnesses and no pressure, whether you wish it. She looked at Thane, standing by the window with his back very straight, and his eyes very carefully on the rooftops outside. She said, Kervale, with respect, get out of my room. Kervale, Alpha King of the Northern Ridges, laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh. It was a good laugh. He got up. He said, As you wish, Hollowroot. And he went. When the door shut, Thane turned. He did not come closer. He said, You do not have to. She said, Thane. He said, I mean it. You do not. You have been claimed by this kingdom in 5 days, more times than most people are claimed in a lifetime, and I will not be another claim on you. If you tell me to step back, I will step back. If you tell me to wait, I will wait. If you tell me I misread the thing in the doorway, I will accept that, though I will not believe it. She said, Come here. He came. He sat on the bed, careful of Cleo, who was still asleep on Lyra's collarbone.
she said quietly around the child's head. I have spent 22 years being stepped past. I would like, for the rest of my life, to be stepped toward. Do you understand me? He said, Yes. She said, Then step toward. He bent his head. He kissed her, carefully, for a long time, and the hum in her chest rose up to meet the hum in his, and under Lyra's good hand on his jaw, she felt the muscle there unlock, for what might have been the first time in a very long while. Cleo, without waking, said, Gross, and rolled over. They broke apart, both laughing, and Lyra thought, This, I will take this, I will take all of this, for as long as the world will let me. A year later, in the warm, slow end of a ridge summer, Lyra was kneeling in the herb garden behind the Alpha's hall, with her sleeves rolled up and her hands full of mint. She had learned, among other things, that she liked gardens. She had planted this one herself in the spring, in a strip of ground that had been bare when she arrived, and was now a riot of green. Mint and thyme and coltsfoot, and a soft, silver-leafed thing Alina called moonfoot, which grew only where a hollow root had tended the soil, and which Lyra had taken as a private joke with her own blood. Fay the hound, who had come to the ridge on Lyra's insistence, and who had decided, within a week, that she had always lived there, was stretched in the shade of the garden wall, snoring. Cleo, now 7 and taller by a handspan, was crouched beside Lyra with great concentration, pulling up what she insisted was a weed, and what Lyra was almost sure was a very young parsley. Lyra did not correct her. Cleo had her own relationship with plants. From the archway that led out into the courtyard, a voice said, Torchbearer. Lyra did not turn. She smiled at the mint. She said, War-sworn. Thane came up behind her and put his hands, light, on her shoulders. He said, Your father-in-law is asking for you. Lyra said, My father-in-law can wait 10 minutes. He is not dying. Thane said, He is not dying, no. She said, Sable. Thane said, No crisis, only that the rider from the southern villages is back, and your cousins will come at the equinox, all 6 of them, with their children. Lyra's hands paused in the mint. She said, All 6. He said, All 6. She stood up slowly, because she had learned over the past year that standing up too fast still sometimes brought a brief sparkle of silver to the edges of her vision, the last ghost of a power that answered only to need, and had not needed to answer in a long while. She turned in his hands. She put her palms flat against his chest over the place where the bond hummed low and even, and she said, Thane Ashfall. He said, Lyra Ashfall. She said, That's still new. I like it. He said, Me too. She said, I have something to tell you. He said, I know. She said, You know. He said, Alina told me this morning. I am sorry. I did not want to spoil your telling. I tried to be surprised. I am bad at being surprised. Lyra laughed. She said, How long have you known? He said, 3 days. Your scent changed. He touched the hollow of her throat with one careful knuckle. He said, I did not say anything because I wanted you to say it. She said, You are a ridiculous man. He said, I am told.
She took his hand and put it flat against her still flat stomach. She said, "A girl. Alina says a girl." He said, "A girl." Lyra said, "I want to name her Mira." He did not speak for a long moment. He said, finally, "Yes. Yes, Lyra. Yes." Cleo, who had been listening from the mint patch with all the discretion of a 7-year-old, said, "I knew first. I knew last week. Faye told me." Lyra said, "Faye tells you a great many things." Cleo said, "Faye knows everything." And Faye, from the shade of the wall, thumped her tail once in sleepy agreement. They walked back to the hall together through the long gold afternoon, Thane's arm around her waist, Cleo racing ahead with Faye laboring good-naturedly behind. And Lyra thought, as she often did now, of the night she had stepped in front of a stranger in a way-station common room and taken a black iron bolt through the shoulder. She thought of how cold she had been before it. She thought of her mother at the dream hearth saying, "Not broken, little fire, only banked." She thought of the 700 kneeling on a windy ridge at dawn, and of Cleo wrapped in silver, and of Oric dying on his own blade, and of Voss dropping like a cut string, and of Thane's hand, the first time, against the side of her neck. She thought, also, of the carved bone token, which lived now in a small cedar box on her dressing table, its silver runes quiet, its work long done. At the hall door, Thane stopped her. He said, "One more thing." She said, "What?" He kissed her, carefully, the way he had kissed her the first time, a kiss that asked and did not demand. When he drew back, he said, "Thank you." She said, "For what?" He said, "For stepping in front." She said, "Thane Ashfall, if you start thanking me for that, I will never hear the end of it." He said, "You will never hear the end of it." She laughed, and they went inside, and the ridge summer went on around them, warm and ordinary and miraculous, the way all homecomings are. And if you are still listening, if you have come all this way with Lyra and Thane and Sable and Cleo and Faye and Care and the 700 and the silver fire and the carved bone token on the washstand at dawn, then I would love to know how this one landed for you. Rate it for me, 1 to 10 in the comments below, and tell me the moment that hit hardest. If you want more stories like this one, about torchbearers who turn out to be queens, and war-sworn men who learn to kneel, and small girls who know things before the grown-ups do, then do me the kindness of subscribing to the channel, so the next one finds you when it's ready. Until then, mind your crossroads, keep your torches lit, and remember, little fire, you were never broken. You were only banked.